The jasmine was in full bloom the morning Solana Shara married the love of her life. It clung to the iron gates of the Belcourt estate in thick white clusters, perfuming the June air with a sweetness so heavy it felt like something you could hold in your hands. 300 guests sat in neat rows of mahogany chairs on the south lawn, their faces tilted toward the afternoon sun like flowers seeking warmth, and everywhere you looked, there were roses. Pale blush roses woven through the archway where Solène would say her vows. Deep crimson roses cascading from crystal vases on every table in the reception tent. White roses pinned to the lapels of groomsmen who stood in a line so straight it looked rehearsed, because it had been, 4 times, because Darian Holt believed that perfection was not a goal, but a standard. Solène stood behind the doors of the estate's bridal suite, her fingers trembling against the beaded bodice of a dress that had taken 6 months to design and 3 fittings to perfect. Her reflection stared back at her from a full-length mirror framed in antique gold, and for a moment she barely recognized herself. The woman in the glass looked like someone from a painting, dark skin luminous against ivory lace, her black hair swept into an elaborate updo threaded with tiny pearls that caught the light every time she moved. Her eyes, wide and brown and framed by lashes that her makeup artist had spent 40 minutes perfecting, glistened with tears that only fall on the happiest days of your life. She had waited 7 years for this moment. 7 years of loving Darian Holt through his medical school and residency, through late-night arguments about money and distance and the 1,000 small fractures that threatened to break them apart before they ever made it to the altar. 7 years of choosing him, over and over, even when choosing him meant choosing sacrifice. She had turned down a fellowship in Chicago because he wanted to stay close to his family. She had postponed her own career ambitions so he could build his practice first. She had bent and bent and bent until her shape fit perfectly into the space he had made for her in his life. And she had done it all willingly because she believed, with every fiber of her being, that Darian Holt was her forever. Today was supposed to be the proof. The beautiful, undeniable, witnessed by everyone they had ever known proof that all of it had been worth it. Her phone buzzed on the vanity table, and she glanced at the screen. A text from her younger sister, Malene, who was supposed to be in the bridal suite 30 minutes ago for photos. Running late. Be there soon. Sorry. Solène smiled and shook her head. Malene was always late, always apologizing, always arriving in a whirlwind of breathless excuses and disarming charm that made it impossible to stay angry with her. It was just who she was, the wild one, the spontaneous one, the one who lived like consequences were something that happened to other people. Where Solène was careful and deliberate, Malene was reckless and impulsive, and somehow their differences had always made them closer rather than driving them apart. Or so Solène had always believed. The processional music began at exactly 4:15, a string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon with the precise elegance that Darian had insisted upon. Solene's father, a quiet man with calloused hands and gentle eyes, offered her his arm, and together they stepped through the doors onto the sunlit lawn. 300 faces turned toward her, and the collective intake of breath was audible. She was beautiful, and she knew it, not with vanity but with gratitude, because today of all days, she wanted to be worthy of the moment she had spent her whole adult life building toward. Her father squeezed her arm, and she felt him trembling, and she realized with a swell of tenderness that he was trying not to cry. She kept her eyes on Darian as she walked. He stood at the altar in a charcoal suit that made his shoulders look broader than they were, his sandy brown hair combed back in a way that showed off the jawline she had once told him could cut glass. He was watching her approach, and there was something in his expression that she registered without fully processing. Something tight around his eyes and mouth that did not match the occasion. She told herself it was nerves. Everyone got nervous at their wedding. It meant nothing. She reached the altar. Her father kissed her cheek, placed her hand in Darian's, and stepped back. The officiant began to speak, and the words washed over Selene like warm water, familiar phrases about love and commitment and the sacred bond between two people who chose each other above all others. She was so focused on Darian's face, searching for the smile she knew so well, that she almost missed the movement at the edge of her vision. Meline was standing among the bridesmaids, exactly where she was supposed to be, in the lavender dress Solène had chosen for the bridal party. But she was not looking at Selene. She was looking at Darian, and the expression on her face was one that Selene had never seen her sister wear before. It was guilt, raw and undisguised, mixed with something else that took Selene a moment to identify. Longing. The officiant reached the vows. Selene spoke hers first, her voice steady and clear, each word a promise she meant with her entire soul. She watched Darian's face as she spoke, watched him swallow hard, watched his eyes flicker, just for a second, toward the bridesmaids, toward Meline. Then it was his turn. The silence that followed lasted only 4 seconds. Solène would replay those 4 seconds for months afterward, dissecting every micro-expression that crossed Darian's face in that tiny eternity. She would remember the way his jaw worked, the way his fingers tightened around hers and then loosened, the way he looked at her with something that she would eventually recognize as pity. "I cannot do this," he said. The words were quiet, almost whispered, but in the hush of 300 people holding their breath, they carried like a gunshot. Selena heard them, understood them, and still her brain refused to process them. She stood there with her hands in his, her wedding dress pooling around her feet like a white sea, and waited for him to explain. To say he was overwhelmed, to say he needed a moment, to say anything that would make those 4 words mean something other than what they so clearly meant. "Selene, I am so sorry," Darian said, and now his voice was louder, carrying across the lawn to the guests who sat frozen in their mahogany chairs. "I have been lying to you, and I cannot stand up here and make promises I know I will not keep." He released her hands. He actually let them fall to her sides, like things he no longer had use for, and then he turned. Not toward the officiant, not toward the exit, toward Meline. The sound that rose from the guests was something between a gasp and a moan, a collective exhalation of horror that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the summer air. Selene watched, her body frozen and her mind screaming, as Darianne walked the 6 steps from the altar to where her sister stood among the bridesmaids. She watched as Meline's face crumpled with something that looked like anguish, but did not look like surprise. She watched as Darianne took her sister's hand, the same hand that had helped Selene zip up her wedding dress that morning, and held it against his chest. "I am in love with Meline," he said, and the words hit Selene like a physical blow, like something with weight and edges that tore through her chest and left a hole where her heart had been beating only moments before. "I have been for months, and I cannot marry you knowing that." Selene did not scream. She did not cry. She did not collapse, though her knees begged her to. She stood perfectly still at the altar where she was supposed to become a wife, and felt the entire architecture of her life collapse around her in absolute silence. Every single pair of eyes pressed against her skin like a physical weight, and she could feel their pity and their shock and their morbid fascination from every direction. Her mother was on her feet, one hand pressed to her mouth. Her father had gone gray, his gentle face twisted into an expression she had never witnessed. And Meline, her baby sister, and the girl she had taught to ride a bicycle, and helped through her first heartbreak, and loved with a ferocity that only older sisters understand, would not look at her. Selene reached up very slowly and removed the veil from her hair. She folded it once, then twice, then placed it on the altar beside the rings she would never wear. And then she walked. Not toward Darian and Meline, not toward her parents, not toward any of the witnesses who would spend the rest of the evening talking about what they had just seen. She walked straight down the center aisle, her chin lifted and her spine rigid and her eyes fixed on a point in the distance that only she could see, and she did not stop until the estate's iron gates closed behind her and the jasmine swallowed her whole. She walked for an hour in her wedding dress, the beaded bodice scratched against her skin with every step, and the cathedral-length train dragged behind her through sidewalk grime and gutter water, collecting dirt and leaves, and the remnants of a discarded newspaper that clung to the lace like it belonged there. People stared. Of course they stared. A woman in a full wedding gown walking alone through the streets at dusk was not something you saw every day, and Selene could feel their eyes on her the same way she had felt the eyes of the wedding guests, heavy with questions she had no intention of answering. She did not know where she was going. She had no purse, no phone, and no wallet. She had left everything at the estate, everything except the dress and the pearl hairpins and the engagement ring that still sat on her finger because she had been too numb to think about removing it. Her feet ached in the satin heels that had been dyed to match the gown, and blisters were forming on both ankles, hot and sharp. But the pain felt distant, like it belonged to someone else's body. Eventually, she stopped walking because her legs simply refused to carry her any further. She found herself standing outside a restaurant she did not recognize, somewhere in a part of the city she had never visited, with night settling over the skyline like a bruise. The restaurant was upscale, with floor-to-ceiling windows and soft lighting and people inside who looked like they had never been humiliated in front of everyone they knew. There was a terrace wrapped around the side of the building, mostly empty in the early evening chill, and Selene lowered herself onto a bench near the entrance without really deciding to sit down. Her body simply folded, like a structure that had finally exceeded its load-bearing capacity. She sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, feeling nothing, existing in a strange hollow space between shock and grief, where everything was muffled and distant and vaguely unreal. Pedestrians passed her on the sidewalk and looked away quickly, the way people do when they encounter someone else's visible pain and do not want it to become their own. The tears came eventually. Not the graceful, cinematic tears she had cried that morning while looking at her reflection. These were ugly tears, the kind that twisted your face and stole your breath and made sounds that did not belong to any language. She pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle them, but they escaped anyway, raw and animal, and full of a grief so total it felt like drowning. She cried for the 7 years she had given to a man who had handed them back like a gift he did not want. She cried for the sister who had betrayed her in the most public and permanent way imaginable. She cried for the future she had built in her mind, the house and the children and the growing old together, all of it erased in 4 seconds of silence and 5 words she would never unhear. And she cried for herself, for the woman who had reshaped her entire life around someone else's comfort, and who was now sitting on a bench outside a restaurant she did not know, in a dress that no longer meant anything, with absolutely nowhere left to go. She did not notice the black car parked across the street. She did not notice the man in the back seat who had been watching her for the past 15 minutes, with an expression that no one in his organization would have recognized. She did not notice the way he leaned forward slightly when her crying intensified, or the way his hand moved toward the door handle before he caught himself and pulled it back. She did not notice any of it, because Selene Ashara had just lost everything she had ever loved, and the world beyond her grief had simply ceased to exist. But he noticed her. And that would change everything. Kale Yoon had not built an empire by feeling sorry for strangers. He had grown up in the back rooms of Incheon's waterfront district, where sympathy was a currency no one could afford, and survival was the only language that mattered. His father, a dock worker who had clawed his way into the smuggling trade through equal parts ambition and brutality, had taught him 2 lessons before dying face down in a shipping container at the age of 41. First, Trust is a weapon that other people use against you. Second, never let anyone see what you are thinking. Cale had taken both lessons to heart and refined them into an art form. By 25, he had consolidated his father's scattered operations into a network that stretched from Seoul to San Francisco. By 30, he controlled enough of the Pacific trade corridor that legitimate businessmen sought his approval before making moves in markets he had quietly cornered. By 34, which was his current age, he had accumulated the kind of wealth that made governments nervous and the kind of reputation that made dangerous men polite. He was in the city for 72 hours, a business matter that required his physical presence, a negotiation that could not be conducted through intermediaries. He had concluded the meeting an hour ago at the very restaurant outside which this woman now sat, destroying herself with grief, and he had been reviewing documents in the back of his car when the sight of her stopped him mid-sentence. A woman in a wedding dress, alone, walking through the city like a ghost haunting her own funeral. He had watched her sit down. He had watched her stare into the middle distance with eyes that saw nothing. And he had watched her break apart, slowly and then all at once, like a dam giving way under pressure it was never designed to hold. Cale did not understand his own reaction. He had witnessed suffering before, had caused more than his share of it, and had long ago developed the emotional calluses necessary to move through the world without being slowed by other people's pain. But something about this woman, about the way she pressed her hands over her mouth, as if she could physically contain her anguish, about the rigid dignity of her posture even as everything inside her collapsed, reached past every defense he had constructed and touched something he had thought was dead. She was beautiful. He noticed this the way he noticed everything, automatically, cataloging details with the precision of a man whose survival depended on observation. Dark skin against white lace, high cheekbones wet with tears, a mouth that trembled but did not open to ask for help. But it was not her beauty that held his attention. It was her solitude. The absolute, uncompromising aloneness of a woman who had clearly been surrounded by people only hours ago and now sat as if she were the last person left on earth. He knew that feeling. He had lived inside it for most of his life. "Sir," said Tai-ho from the driver's seat, his voice carefully neutral in the way it always became when he sensed his employer doing something unpredictable. "The hotel is expecting us. Shall I pull forward?" Kel did not answer immediately. He watched the woman wipe her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheekbone in a dark streak that made her look like a warrior returning from a battle she had lost. "No," Kyle said. "Not yet." Tai-ho's eyes found him in the rearview mirror, a question in them that he was too disciplined to ask aloud. They had worked together long enough for Tai-ho to recognize the tone. It was the tone that preceded decisions that could not be reversed. "She has been sitting there for 20 minutes, Cale said quietly, more to himself than to Tai-ho. "In a wedding dress, alone. No phone, no bag. No one has stopped to ask if she is all right." "It is not our concern, sir," Tai-ho offered carefully. "No," Kyle agreed, his eyes still fixed on the woman on the bench. "It is not." But even as he said it, his hand was reaching for the door handle again. And this time, he did not pull it back. Solen did not hear the footsteps approaching until a shadow fell across her lap and blocked the glow of the streetlight she had been staring through without seeing. She looked up, expecting a police officer or a concerned passerby, or perhaps a request that she move along. Instead, she found a man she had never seen before, standing 3 feet away with his hands in the pockets of a coat that looked like it cost more than her monthly rent. He was tall, lean in a way that suggested discipline rather than deprivation, with black hair cut close at the sides and longer on top, swept back from a face that seemed designed to give nothing away. His eyes were dark and steady, watching her with an intensity that should have frightened her, but instead made her feel, for the first time in hours, like she actually existed. You are going to ruin that dress, he said. Of all the things she had expected to hear, that was not one of them. She blinked at him, her tear-swollen eyes struggling to focus, and then looked down at herself. The gown was destroyed. The train was black with street grime, the beading was catching on the rough wood of the bench, and there was a tear along the side seam. She stared at the damage, and then did something she would not have predicted in 1,000 years. She laughed. It was not a pleasant laugh. It was raw and broken and edged with hysteria, the kind of sound that lives in the space between crying and losing your mind entirely. But it was real, and it surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise the man standing in front of her. I think the dress is the least of my problems right now, she said, her voice rough from crying, but thank you for your concern. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement of something. He glanced at the bench beside her, then back at her face, as if asking permission with a look rather than words. She did not grant it, but she did not refuse it either, and after a moment he sat down, leaving a careful distance between them. You walked here, he said. It was not a question. How do you know that? Your shoes. He nodded toward her feet, and she looked down to see the satin heels she had forgotten she was wearing. They were destroyed, the dye bleeding into dark stains, the heels scuffed down to the raw material. One of them had a thin line of blood along the strap where a blister had burst. I watched you arrive, he continued, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the wreckage of her life. From across the street. You walked for a long time before you stopped. You were watching me? The alarm that should have accompanied that realization was strangely absent. She was too empty to feel afraid, too hollowed out by grief to manufacture the appropriate concern about a stranger who had been observing her from a parked car. I was sitting in my car when you appeared. It was difficult not to notice a woman in a wedding gown walking alone through the city at dusk. Wonderful. That is exactly what I needed today. More people staring at me. She wiped her eyes again, wincing at the mascara that came away on her fingers. Look, I appreciate you checking on me, or whatever this is. But I am fine. I just need a minute. You are not fine, he said simply. And I suspect you need considerably more than a minute. The directness of it caught her off guard. People did not talk to her like that. People talked around things, softened edges, wrapped hard truths in cushions of polite concern. This man spoke like someone who had no patience for the distance between what was real and what was comfortable. You are right, she said, and the admission cost her something. I am not fine. I am about as far from fine as a person can get without being clinically dead, but I do not see how that is any of your business. It is not, he agreed. I have no business being here at all. And yet, he gestured at himself sitting on the bench, emotion so understated it was almost humorous, and as if his own presence was a mystery he could not quite explain. Selene studied him for a long moment. He was not from here. She could tell that much. There was something in his features and his bearing, in the precise way he held himself, that spoke of somewhere else. His English was flawless but carried a faint undertone, a musicality in the vowels that suggested another language lived in his mouth first. Who are you? She asked. Someone who has nowhere to be for the next 30 minutes, he replied, and who would rather spend them here than in the back of a car reviewing contracts. That is not an answer. It is the only one I am prepared to give a woman I met 90 seconds ago. He paused, and that almost smile appeared again. You, on the other hand, are much easier to read. You were supposed to get married today. The groom did something unforgivable, likely involving someone close to you, based on the specific quality of your grief. And now you are sitting on a bench in a part of the city you have never visited, with no phone and no way home. because walking into the unknown felt safer than staying in a place where everyone had just witnessed your humiliation. Each word landed with surgical precision, peeling back layers she had not given him permission to touch. She should have been angry, but the accuracy of it, the strange comfort of being seen so clearly by someone who owed her nothing, dissolved her defenses before she could raise them. "My sister," she said, and she did not know why she was telling him this, except that he was a stranger, and strangers were safe, because they held no history and carried no expectations. "He left me for my sister, at the altar, in front of everyone." The silence that followed was different from the silences she had experienced today. It was not the stunned silence of the wedding guests, or the pitying silence of the passers-by. It was a silence that held weight, that suggested the man beside her was processing her words with a seriousness they deserved, rather than scrambling for something comforting to say. "That," he said finally, "is a particular kind of cruelty that most people do not have the stomach for." He said he was in love with her, like that was supposed to explain it. Like love is an excuse for destroying someone in front of everyone they know. "Love is never an excuse," the man said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like personal experience. "It is a reason, a poor one, but a reason nonetheless." The cruelty was not in his feelings. It was in his stage. He could have told you privately. He chose an audience. Selene turned to look at him, struck by the distinction he had drawn. No one else had articulated it that way. In the chaos of the moment, everyone had focused on what Darian had done. No one had questioned why he had done it the way he had. "Why would someone do that?" she asked, and she was not sure if she was asking him or the universe. "Control," he said without hesitation. "Public declarations are not confessions. They are seizures of power." He made every person in that audience a witness to his narrative. The story belongs to him now. He is the man who followed his heart. You are the woman who was left behind. He chose the version of events that made him brave and made you a casualty. The words hit her like cold water, shocking and clarifying at the same time. She had been drowning in grief, but beneath the grief was something she had not yet allowed herself to feel. Anger. "I do not even know your name," she said. "Kale," he said. "And yours?" "Selene. Selene." He repeated it like he was testing the weight of it. "That is a beautiful name for a woman having the worst day of her life." Despite everything, despite the ruined dress and the shattered heart and the absolute catastrophe that her existence had become in the span of 4 seconds, Selene felt something flicker in her chest that she could not quite name. "Thank you," she said, "for sitting down. You did not have to." "No," Kale agreed, rising to his feet with a fluidity that suggested physical training she could not identify. "I did not." He reached into his coat and produced a phone, not his own, but a second device, slim and new, and held it out to her. "Call whoever you need to call, arrange a ride home, and when you are ready, leave the phone on the bench. Someone will collect it." She took it, her fingers brushing his for just a moment, and felt the warmth of his hand even in the evening chill. "You carry a spare phone?" "I carry many things that most people do not," he said, and then he turned and walked back toward the black car across the street, his stride unhurried, his silhouette sharp against the glow of the restaurant windows. Solène watched him go, clutching the phone in one hand and the remnants of her dignity in the other, and realized that for the first time since Darian had dropped her hands at the altar, she did not feel completely alone. She called her college roommate Fenella, because Fenella was the only person in her life who would come without asking questions first and save the interrogation for later. True to form, Fenella arrived in 22 minutes in a dented sedan, with a blanket, a bottle of water, and an expression that suggested she was already composing a list of people she intended to physically harm. "Do not say anything," Selene said, as she climbed into the passenger seat, the wedding dress bunching around her in a cloud of dirty lace. Not yet. I cannot talk about it yet. Fenella nodded, put the car in drive, and took her home without a single word. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for her all day, with one possible exception. That night, lying in her bed in an oversized shirt, with the wedding dress crumpled on the bathroom floor like a body she could not bring herself to deal with, Solène replayed the day in excruciating detail. Every image cut like glass. Darian's face as he let go of her, Maline's guilty eyes, the gasps of guests who had come to celebrate and stayed to witness a demolition. But between the sharp fragments of humiliation and heartbreak, something else kept surfacing. A bench outside a restaurant she could not name. A man in an expensive coat who sat beside her and said things that were true instead of things that were kind. Dark eyes that watched her without pity, without judgment, without any of the performative concern she would spend the coming days drowning in once-word spread about what Darian had done. Kyle. She did not know his last name. She did not know what he did or where he was from or why he had been sitting in a black car on the same night her life had imploded. She knew only that he had seen her at her absolute lowest and had not looked away, and that his words about control and public declarations had given her something she desperately needed: a framework for her anger, a way to understand what had been done to her that did not require her to accept the role of victim. The days that followed were brutal. Her phone, retrieved from the Belcourt estate by Fenella in a covert operation that involved considerable hostility toward the event coordinator, was flooded with messages. Texts from friends who did not know what to say. Voicemails from relatives who said too much. A single message from her mother that contained only 3 words: "Come home, baby." She did not go home. Home meant her parents' house, which meant proximity to Malene, and Solène was not ready for that. Instead, she stayed in her apartment, called in sick to the architecture firm where she worked, and existed in the strange, suspended animation of a person whose life had been violently rearranged without her consent. She did not try to find Cale. She had left his phone on the bench as instructed, and she had no way to contact him even if she wanted to. He was a stranger who had shown her an unexpected kindness, and strangers, by definition, did not stay. She told herself this repeatedly, with the kind of aggressive conviction that only accompanies statements you do not actually believe. On the 7th day, she went back to work. On the 8th day, she started eating again. On the 9th day, she almost felt like a person who might eventually be capable of functioning. On the 10th day, the flowers arrived. They were not roses. Solène noticed this immediately, because roses were what Darian had always given her, and the absence of them felt deliberate in a way she could not explain. Instead, the arrangement was built around white orchids and stems of deep violet clematis, woven together with branches of eucalyptus that filled her office with a scent so clean and sharp it felt like opening a window in a room that had been closed for years. There was no card, no note, no florist's tag indicating where the arrangement had come from. "Secret admirer?" asked Rowena, the senior partner at the firm, pausing by Solène's desk with her coffee and a raised eyebrow. "I have no idea who sent them," Solène said, and it was mostly true. She had an idea. A wild, improbable, completely irrational idea that she was not willing to speak aloud because saying it would make it real, and she was not ready for it to be real. The second arrangement arrived the following day. This time it was pale blue hydrangeas with sprigs of lavender, and this time there was a card. A single line, written in handwriting she had never seen before, angular and precise and slanting slightly to the left. "I hope you have stopped ruining expensive dresses." Solène read the line 4 times, and something happened to her face that she had not expected to happen again for a very long time. She smiled. The 3rd day brought no flowers. Instead, When she left the office at 6:30, she found a black car parked at the curb outside her building. A man she did not recognize stood beside the rear door, his posture formal and his expression professionally blank. "Miss Akara," he said, "Mr. Yoon would like to invite you to dinner." "Mr. Yoon," Solena repeated, and the name settled into place beside the first name she already knew, completing a picture she had been trying not to assemble. Kale Yoon. "And if I decline? Then I will convey your response, and you will not be disturbed again." She stood on the sidewalk for a full minute, her bag on her shoulder and her keys in her hand, and the entire reasonable, responsible, self-preserving part of her brain screaming that she should say no. The flowers were presumptuous. The car was excessive. The entire situation had the shape of something she should walk away from without looking back. But Solène had spent her entire adult life making safe choices. She had chosen the reliable man, the stable career, the careful path that was supposed to lead to a predictable and comfortable life. And where had safety gotten her? Abandoned at an altar by a man she had trusted with everything she had. Maybe it was time to stop being safe. "Where is the dinner?" she asked. The restaurant was on the 42nd floor of a building she had admired from a distance but never entered. The elevator opened directly into a private dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline like a painting, and Kale was already there, standing by the window with a glass of something amber in his hand, silhouetted against the glittering sprawl below. He turned when she entered, and she saw his face clearly for the first time in proper lighting. He was more striking than she remembered. Not handsome in the conventional, symmetrical way that Darian had been. His features were sharper, more angular, with cheekbones that cast shadows and a mouth that seemed calibrated for precision rather than warmth. But his eyes, those dark, steady, impossibly attentive eyes, were exactly as she remembered them. "You came," he said, and there was something in his tone that told her he had not been entirely certain she would. "You sent flowers to my office," she replied, setting her bag on a chair with a composure she did not feel. "Which means you know where I work. Which means you looked into me. Which means you are either very interested or very dangerous. And I came here tonight to find out which." "The answer is both," Kale said without hesitation. "But I suspect you already knew that." She had. On some level, in some part of her mind that operated on instinct rather than logic, she had known it from the moment he sat beside her on that bench. There was a gravity to this man, a density of presence that ordinary people simply did not possess. "Sit down, Solène. Let me explain why I asked you here, and then you can decide if you want to stay." She sat. Kale sat across from her, and for a moment he simply looked at her, studying her face the way he had done that first night, as if she were a text in a language he was still learning to read. "I am going to be honest with you," he said, "because I think you have had enough dishonesty to last a lifetime, and because I find that I do not want to be another person who lies to you." "That is a good start." "I run an organization," he continued, choosing his words with care. "An international one, based primarily in Seoul, with significant operations here. The nature of my work is complex, and some of it exists in spaces that most people would find uncomfortable. I am not a criminal in the way that movies portray criminals, but I am not a saint either. I occupy a gray area that requires a certain kind of flexibility, both moral and practical." "You are telling me you are dangerous," Solène said. "I am telling you that my life is dangerous. There is a distinction. A subtle one. Most important distinctions are." He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "I am also telling you this because of what I am about to ask you, and I want you to understand the full context before you give me your answer. Ask." "I am in the process of establishing a foundation," Kale said. "A legitimate one, fully transparent, designed to provide architectural rehabilitation for communities that have been neglected by traditional development. Schools, clinics, community centers, housing. The kind of work that requires someone with vision, technical skill, and the ability to see beauty in broken things. He paused, and the look he gave her carried a weight that went beyond the professional proposition he was constructing. I have reviewed your portfolio, your thesis project, the adaptive reuse designs, and the community consultation work you did before you joined your current firm. You are talented, Solène, far more talented than the firm you work for deserves. You reviewed my portfolio, she said flatly. Do you understand how that sounds from my side of the table? It sounds like a man who is accustomed to doing thorough research before making a significant investment, Cale replied. I do not apologize for being prepared, but I want to be clear. If you tell me tonight that you are not interested, I will respect that completely. You will never hear from me again. He leaned forward slightly, and the city lights caught his eyes in a way that made them look almost luminous. But I hope you will not say that. Because I think this project could change lives, and I think you are the person who should lead it. Why me? She asked, needing to hear him say it. Cale was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, the careful professionalism in his voice softened into something more personal, more exposed. Because I sat on a bench with a woman who had just lost everything, and she did not ask me for pity. She did not perform her grief for my benefit. She simply sat there and endured it with more dignity than most people bring to their finest moments. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I have spent my life surrounded by people who want something from me. You are the first person in a very long time who did not want anything at all. And that made me want to give you something worth having. The silence between them stretched like a wire pulled taut. I need time, she said finally. You have it. And I need you to understand that if I say yes, it is because of the project, not because of the flowers or the car or the dinner or the view. Of course, Cale said, and there was that almost smile again. Strictly professional. Neither of them believed it, and both of them knew that the other did not believe it either. And somehow, that honesty, that mutual acknowledgement of the thing they were not yet ready to name, felt more real than any promise Selene had ever been made. She said yes on a Thursday, 3 days after the dinner. She gave her notice at the architecture firm the following week and showed up on her first day at the foundation's temporary offices with a notebook full of ideas and a determination to prove, mostly to herself, that she had not lost her mind. The work was extraordinary. The foundation had already acquired 3 properties in underserved neighborhoods, each one a decaying structure with bones good enough to save, and Solene's job was to reimagine them. To take buildings that the city had given up on and transform them into spaces where communities could gather and grow and heal. It was the work she had dreamed about in architecture school, the work that had drawn her to the profession before commercial practice had ground those dreams down to dust. She threw herself into it with an intensity that surprised even her. She spent hours on site, crawling through abandoned structures with measuring tape and a camera, mapping damage and envisioning possibility. She met with community leaders, listened to their needs, and incorporated their voices into designs that grew more ambitious with every revision. And through it all, there was Cale. He was not always present. His business required him to travel frequently. But when he was in the city, he was at the offices almost every day, reviewing her progress with genuine interest. He asked intelligent questions about load-bearing walls and zoning regulations, and she found herself impressed by how quickly he absorbed information that fell entirely outside his expertise. It was during these working sessions that the boundaries began to blur. A conversation about structural engineering would somehow evolve into a discussion about resilience. A debate about color palettes for a community center lobby would drift into childhood memories. Solène describing the house she grew up in, with its mismatched paint and creaking floors. Kale offering sparse but vivid fragments of a childhood in Incheon that sounded nothing like hers and somehow resonated with everything she understood about the distance between where you start and where you end up. He brought her coffee without asking how she took it, and she did not realize until the third time that he had gotten it right on the first. The collision with her old life came 6 weeks in. Maline's number appeared on her screen during a site visit, and Selene stared at it for 4 rings before letting it go to voicemail. The message was 37 seconds long. Selene, I know you do not want to talk to me. I understand. But I need you to know that I am sorry. What happened was not planned. Darian and I, we tried to fight it. But you cannot control who you love. Please call me. I miss my sister. Selene deleted the message and sat very still for a long time. You cannot control who you love. It was the same self-absolving narrative that recast betrayal as inevitability and cruelty as fate. It made her sick. It made her furious. And underneath the fury, in the place she tried hardest not to look, it made her grieve all over again for the sister she had lost. She was still sitting in her car when her phone buzzed again. Kale. 2 words. You okay? She typed back the only honest answer she had. No. He was at the site within 20 minutes. He did not ask what had happened. He did not offer platitudes or solutions. He simply stood beside her in the gutted shell of a building that was being reborn and said, "Show me what you are working on." And she did. She walked him through the space, pointing out the original brickwork she planned to restore, the arched windows she was going to reframe, the courtyard she envisioned where children could play and neighbors could sit. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping, pouring every ounce of emotion she could not direct at her sister into the work that had become her lifeline, and Kale listened to every word with the full weight of his attention. When she finished, Kale looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something raw and unguarded, and startlingly tender, and it lasted only a second before he caught himself and smoothed it away. But Selene saw it, and she knew that whatever was happening between them had already gone far beyond anything she could call professional. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them had to. The gala was Kale's idea. A fundraising event to introduce the foundation to the city's philanthropic community, held in the partially restored shell of their first project building. Selene had designed the space herself, transforming the industrial bones of the structure into something ethereal with strategic lighting, cascading greenery, and architectural models displayed on pedestals. She wore a black dress that Fenella had helped her choose after a 4-hour shopping expedition that involved 3 stores and 1 minor emotional breakdown in a fitting room. The dress was simple, elegant, nothing like the elaborate gown she had worn at the wedding, and she chose it precisely for that reason. The evening began perfectly. Donors circulated through the space with champagne glasses in hand, and Kyle moved through the room beside her, introducing her to people whose names she recognized from magazine covers. She noticed the way he presented her. Not as his employee, not as his project, as his partner, his equal. It was intoxicating, and she was so caught up in the momentum of the evening that she did not notice the new arrivals until Fenella appeared at her elbow with a face the color of chalk. "Solène," Fenella whispered, her fingers digging into Solene's arm. "Do not turn around, but you need to know that Darian just walked in, and Maline is with him." The world contracted. The noise of the gala became a distant hum, like hearing sound through deep water. They were here, at her event, in the space she had designed, the space that represented everything she had rebuilt from the rubble of what they had destroyed. She turned around. They stood near the entrance, Darian in a tailored navy suit and Maline in a red dress, holding hands. Darian was scanning the room with an expression Selene recognized, the expression of a man who wanted to be seen, who had chosen this venue and this night because he knew she would be here, and he wanted her to know that he had moved on. It was the altar all over again. A public stage, a performance designed to establish his narrative at her expense. Solène felt her composure begin to crack, and she was on the verge of retreating to a back room when a hand settled against the small of her back. Cale's touch was light, barely there, but it steadied her like an anchor dropped into churning water. When she looked up at his face, his expression had not changed, but his eyes had gone cold. Not angry. Something far more controlled than anger. "Stay with me," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Do not let them see you waver." Darian spotted her across the room and began moving toward them, pulling Malene along behind him. "Solène," Darian said, his voice carrying false warmth. "This is incredible. We saw the invitation through a friend, and I thought we should come support you." Support. The word landed like a slap wrapped in silk. Selena opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. It was Cale who spoke. "You must be the ex-fiancé," he said, and his voice was the temperature of winter in the mountains, polished and lethal and devoid of any pretense of warmth. "The one who made his confession at the altar instead of in private. I have to say, the courage it takes to show your face at the event of the woman you publicly humiliated is almost admirable." Almost. The silence that followed was absolute. Donors nearest to them had stopped talking, champagne glasses frozen halfway to mouths. Darian's face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: surprise, then indignation, then something that looked suspiciously like fear as he registered the quality of the man addressing him, the suit, the bearing, and the dangerous calm that radiated from Cale like heat from a banked fire. "I am sorry," Darian said, recovering with practiced smoothness. "And you are?" Cale did not answer the question. Instead, he turned to Selene, and the coldness in his eyes melted into something so warm and so deliberate that she felt it in her sternum. He took her hand, lifting it gently, naturally, as if this were something they had done 1,000 times before, and looked at Darian with an expression that was simultaneously polite and annihilating. "She is with me now," he said. 3 words, 4 syllables, and the entire room heard them. Solène felt the ground shift beneath her feet. But this time it was not the sickening tilt of collapse. It was the sensation of something new being built, something unexpected and terrifying and undeniably real. She understood with perfect clarity what he was doing. He was giving her what Darian had taken: a public moment, a narrative, a version of events in which she was not the woman who was left behind, but the woman who had been found by someone who recognized her worth. Malene had gone pale. Darian stared at their joined hands, and Solène watched something crumble behind his eyes, some comfortable belief that she would spend the rest of her life in the wreckage he had made. "We should go," Malene said quietly, tugging at Darian's sleeve. "Yes," Cale agreed pleasantly. "You should." They left. They actually left, retreating through the crowd with the hunched posture of people who had expected to command a room and instead had been dismissed from one. Selene watched them go, and the feeling that bloomed in her chest was not triumph. It was liberation. The gala ended at midnight. Solène found herself standing alone in the center of the space she had designed. Her feet ached. Her face hurt from smiling, and she felt more alive than she had felt in months. Kyle appeared beside her as if summoned by the silence. He had removed his jacket, and his sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and he looked almost approachable in the dim light. Almost. "I should apologize," he said. "For what?" "For speaking for you. For making a declaration without your consent. It was not my place." "Did you mean it?" she asked. The question hung between them, heavy with implication. "Every word." She kissed him. Not the other way around. She closed the distance between them and pressed her mouth to his, and it was nothing like the kisses she had shared with Darian, which had always been gentle and measured and slightly performative. This was urgent and honest and full of a hunger she had not known she was carrying, and when Kale's hands found her waist and pulled her closer, she felt every wall she had built since the wedding come crashing down in a collapse that felt like relief. When they finally broke apart, breathless and trembling, Selene said the only thing that felt true. "I am scared." "Good," Kale said, his forehead resting against hers. "So am I." The days after the gala were a free fall, not the destructive kind. This was the other kind of falling, the kind where the wind catches you and you realize that what you thought was descent is actually flight. They did not rush. Kale took her to dinner in small places with checkered tablecloths and wine lists written in chalk on blackboards, and she understood that he was showing her a version of himself that existed outside the empire he had built. The version that ate noodles with his hands and laughed at stories that were not funny and looked at her across a table like she was the only coherent thought in his head. She took him to her job sites, put a hard hat on his head, and walked him through collapsing structures while explaining the physics of renovation with a passion that made his eyes go soft. She showed him her sketches, the raw ones, the ones she never showed clients because they were too personal. He studied each one carefully, and when he looked up from a drawing of a community garden she had designed around the concept of grief, transforming into growth, his expression nearly undid her. "This is what you see," he said quietly. "When you look at broken things, you see what they could become." "Yes," she said. "Is that strange?" "It is the least strange thing about you. It is the thing that makes you extraordinary." They were sitting on the floor of a gutted building when she asked him the question she had been carrying since the bench. "What happened to you? Before all of this? Before the empire and the suits and the cars? Who were you before you became this?" Kale was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then he leaned his head back against the exposed brick wall and closed his eyes. "I was a boy who watched his father die in a shipping container when he was 14 years old. A boy who was told by the men who worked for his father that he had two choices: lead or be buried beside him. I chose to lead because I was afraid, and I have been making choices driven by fear ever since." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "I built all of this because I was terrified of being powerless. Every deal, every expansion, every calculated risk was just another layer between myself and that boy on the docks who had nothing and no one." "And now?" Solène asked softly. "Now I have everything, and none of it means what I thought it would." He took her hand, tracing the lines of her palm with his thumb. "Until you. You are the first thing in 20 years that I did not acquire or build or take. You just appeared, in a ruined dress on a bench, and suddenly all the walls I had built felt like prisons instead of fortresses." "I was supposed to be someone's wife," she said. "That was the plan. That was the whole plan. Love someone steady. Build a safe life. Never take risks." And when that plan exploded in front of everyone I had ever known, I thought I had lost everything. She squeezed his hand. "But I think what I actually lost was the cage I had been building around myself. And what I found was a bench outside a restaurant I had never been to, and a man who told me the truth when everyone else would have told me something kind. I am not a kind man, Solene." "No," she agreed. "You are an honest one. And right now, that is worth more to me than all the kindness in the world." He kissed her then, slow and careful, and full of a tenderness that contradicted everything the world believed about him. And she kissed him back, with a ferocity that contradicted everything she had ever believed about herself. Two people unmasked, sitting on the floor of a building they were going to bring back from the dead, holding on to each other like the plans for something that had never been built before. The threats began 3 weeks after the gala, not with violence, with information. A manila envelope left on Selene's desk at the Foundation offices, unsealed, containing photographs of Kale entering buildings she did not recognize, meeting with men whose faces were obscured by shadow, exchanging items that looked like evidence. There was no note, no demand, just the photographs and the implication they carried. Selene stared at them for 20 minutes before calling Kale. He arrived within the hour, and the expression on his face when he saw the photographs told her everything she needed to know. "The Seijin Syndicate," he said, his voice stripped of every shade of warmth. "They have been trying to force a merger for 2 years. I have refused. This is their way of applying pressure. By targeting me? By showing you who I am." He spread the photographs across her desk. "These are real, Selene. These meetings happened. The things I do when I am not here, they look exactly like this. Dark rooms and dangerous men and transactions that would not survive the light of day." She heard the challenge in his voice, the expectation that this would be the moment she finally saw him clearly, and recoiled. "I know who you are," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "You told me on the 42nd floor. Gray areas, moral flexibility. I did not think you were speaking in metaphors. Knowing it and seeing it are different things." "Yes, they are, but I am still here." He collected the photographs and put the envelope in his coat. "This will escalate. The photographs are a warning. The next step will be more direct." "More direct how?" He did not answer, and his silence was louder than any words he could have chosen. The escalation came 10 days later, and it did not come from the Seijin Syndicate. It came from Darien. Solène found him leaning against her car outside the Foundation offices, his arms crossed, and his expression carved into the self-righteous concern she had spent 7 years mistaking for genuine care. "We need to talk," he said. "No," Solène replied, reaching past him for her car door. "We do not. Solène, I know about him. I know about Kale Yoon. Do you have any idea who he is? What he does?" Darian's voice dropped to a hiss that sounded like jealousy wearing a mask. "The people he is connected to, the things his organization is involved in, you are in over your head." "You left me at the altar for my sister," Selene said, and each word landed with deliberate weight. "You do not get to have opinions about my choices anymore. This is not about us. This is about your safety." "So I have been told. By him. To my face. Before I made my decision." She opened her car door, forcing him to step aside. "The difference between you and Kale is that he was honest with me from the beginning. He told me who he was, and let me choose. You lied to me for months, and made the choice for me in front of everyone we knew. Go home to Malene, Darien. Practice your concern on someone who still believes it is real." She drove away without looking in the rearview mirror, and she made it 4 blocks before her hands started shaking on the steering wheel. Not because of Darien, because of the fear she had been carrying since the photographs appeared on her desk, the fear she had not yet spoken aloud because speaking it would make it real. She was in danger. Real danger. The kind that showed up in envelopes and ex-fiancés, and the growing certainty that the world Kyle inhabited was closing around her like a structure with no exits. That night she lay awake and fought a battle with herself that had no clear front lines. She loved him. The word had arrived without announcement, immovable and undeniable. She loved a man who existed in shades of gray, who had enemies that now knew her name and her face, and the location of her office. Her phone buzzed at 2 in the morning. "Kyle, I know you are awake. I can feel it." She typed back with fingers that trembled. "That is either very romantic or very unsettling." His reply came immediately. "With me, it is usually both." She stared at the screen for a long time, and then she typed the thing she had been afraid to say, the thing that had been building in her chest since the gala, since the bench, since the moment a stranger sat down beside a crying bride and treated her grief with more respect than anyone else in her life ever had. I love you, Kale, and I do not know what to do with that. The three dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. When his response finally arrived, it was 2 words long, and they contained more vulnerability than anything she had ever heard him say aloud. Neither do I. The call came at 3 in the morning on a Sunday. Kale's voice on the other end of the line was stripped of every layer she had come to know. What remained was raw and ragged and frightened in a way she had not believed him capable of. They took Tejo, he said, the Sagen Syndicate. They took him from his apartment tonight, and they are using him to force my hand. They want the merger. They want control of the Pacific Corridor. And they want me to know that everyone close to me is vulnerable. He paused, and she heard him breathe, a sound so heavy it seemed to carry the weight of every choice he had ever made. Including you. Selene sat up in bed, her heart slamming against her ribs, and waited. I am going to fix this, Kale continued, and she heard that lethal stillness she recognized from the gala. But the way I fix it is going to require me to become someone I promised myself I would never be again, and I need you to understand what that means. Tell me. It means blood, Selene. It means walking into a room with men who want to kill me and making them more afraid of what happens if they do than if they do not. It means using every weapon I have, not the metaphorical kind, the real kind. And it means that when I come out the other side, if I come out the other side, I may not be the man you fell in love with anymore. The silence between them was vast and terrible. Selene gripped the phone and felt tears sliding down her face, hot and steady, because she understood what he was really saying. He was giving her an exit. A door she could walk through before the violence began, before his world consumed hers entirely. There is another option, she said. There is not. There is. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and spoke with a clarity that came from somewhere deeper than logic. You walk away. Not just from the Sagen Syndicate. From all of it. The organization, the corridor, the empire. You let it go. You let Taiho's people negotiate his release through channels that do not require you to become something you hate. And you walk away from the table, and you do not go back. You are asking me to give up everything. I am asking you to choose what matters. The silence stretched again, and she could hear the ragged machinery of a man processing the most consequential decision of his life. She thought of the bench outside the restaurant. She thought of designs spread across the floor of a building being reborn. She thought of 3 words spoken in front of a room full of strangers. She is with me now. I do not know who I am without it, Kale said, and his voice broke on the words in a way that shattered something inside her chest. I have been this since I was 14 years old. If I walk away from it, there is nothing left. I am just a boy standing in a shipping container with nothing and no one. No, Selene said, and her voice was fierce and tender and unshakable. You are a man standing in a life that is bigger than anything you built out of fear. You have a foundation that is changing communities. You have buildings full of people whose lives are better because you decided to create something instead of just controlling something. And you have me. She pressed the phone against her ear like she could reach through it and hold him. I am not nothing, Kale. And neither are you. Not without the Empire. Not without the power. Not without any of it. You are enough. Just you. Just the man on the bench who sat with a stranger and did not look away. She heard him exhale, long and shuddering, and in that breath, she heard the sound of walls coming down. Not crumbling, not collapsing. Being deliberately dismantled, brick by brick, by a man who had finally found something worth more than the fortress he had spent his life building. Okay, he said, and then, quieter. Okay. Okay? I will find another way. I will get Tejo back without becoming what they want me to become, and then I will walk away. From the corridor, from the syndicate politics, from all of it. His voice steadied, and she heard something new in it. Something that sounded like the first breath of a man who had been holding his lungs still for 20 years. But I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you will still be there. On the other side. When I am just a man with nothing but a foundation and a woman who fell apart in a wedding dress on a bench outside a restaurant neither of us had ever been to before. Selene closed her eyes and let the tears fall freely, and felt something settle into place inside her chest, with the precision and permanence of a cornerstone being laid. I promise, she said. I will be right here, building something new. With you. The line went quiet, but neither of them hung up. They stayed connected through the silence, breathing together across the distance, two people standing on the edge of a life that did not exist yet, holding on to the only thing that had ever made either of them brave enough to leap. And somewhere in the city, in a building that had once been abandoned and was now becoming something beautiful, Selene's designs waited on the table where she had left them. Drawings of broken structures being made whole. Plans for spaces where people could gather and grow and begin again. It was, she thought, exactly the right metaphor for what came next.